Hello, welcome back. So it's been a little bit of time since I've done a video, so I figured I'd throw one out, and this one's probably going to be a little bit of a longer one. So just as a heads up, this gets into a little bit more of the complicated side of a couple topics, but I'll try to keep it relatively short and simple as best as I can. But what I wanted to talk about was asset management and its importance in the NHL. So a lot of times we see teams that struggle and they could use a fix, they could use this, they could use that, but it doesn't happen. And that may not necessarily be a fault of the general manager not wanting to or not seeing it. Sometimes it's what options are available to the general manager at the time. So, what I wanted to talk about was the big hallmark event, it seemed, of the 2022-2023 offseason, which was a trade between the Florida Panthers and the Calgary Flames. Now, there's a lot of nuances to it. Flames fans were very impressed by the trade because they're like, yeah, Tkachuk didn't want to stay, so we got a boatload for him, and Brad Treliving's a genius. And yes, but I'm going to argue that it's the the really smart stuff came as a result of the trade, but not the trade itself. So I'll kind of break it down. I'm not saying that it wasn't a great offseason. What he did was pretty spectacular, but I think the focus on it is a little bit in the wrong spot. And so we'll go over that a bit. So the trade in question happened July 22nd in the offseason of 2022. And the trade consisted of Matthew Tkachuk going to the Florida Panthers with a 2025 conditional fourth round pick from the Calgary Flames. And Calgary received in exchange Jonathan Huberdeau, Mackenzie Weegar, prospect Cole Schwint, and Florida's 2025 first round pick. It is also a conditional pick. The conditions on both these picks is pretty simple. It's just lottery protected. So I believe if it's top three, it'll revert back to the previous owner. But then the following draft, so in 2026, Calgary would receive that first round pick. So not a bad pickup. That's a boatload that you would expect to get for Matthew Tkachuk um given his talent. Now, the reason that there's a little bit more magic to it than it seemed is because there was a lot of inner workings that had to make that trade happen, and one of them was directly related to the cap hit. So I'll go over quickly the money in, money out, and then I'll come back to it in a little bit in the video. So Matthew Tkachuk signed a $9.5 million contract with the Calgary Flames, which was then traded to Florida. Now, that being said, the cap hit and the cap crunch that most teams are experiencing, you almost have to do dollar in, dollar out. So Jim Treliving took a look at it and he picked up Huberdeau at $5.9 million and Mackenzie Weegar at $3.25 million. Both of those, based on their production last year, it was a steal of a deal, so that definitely helped. But if you notice, there's only about $350,000 changing. So they basically had to do dollar in, dollar out. Now, Calgary did not. And the reason I say that is because what started all of this narrative was at the point of free agency. Johnny Gaudreau left Calgary as a UFA to go to the Columbus Blue Jackets on a 7-year, $68.25 million contract, which worked out to about $9.75 million a year. So that I think Johnny Gaudreau could have gotten more money. I think a lot of it was location. There's a lot of speculation as to why Johnny Gaudreau didn't resign in Calgary. As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter why. It's completely irrelevant. So I'm not going to get into that part. Now, what got lost in translation when Johnny Gaudreau left was that he freed up $6.75 million in cap space for the Calgary Flames. So when Matthew Tkachuk voiced that he didn't have a desire to sign long term with Calgary, that kind of created a bit of a perfect storm for Brad Treliving. So this offseason, Matthew Tkachuk was a restricted free agent, which is part of the difference as to why he didn't just go. Now, based on Matthew Tkachuk's production and his abilities, it was seen that he was likely to make about $9 to $9.5 million a year. So, because he's a restricted free agent, Calgary was entitled to compensation if any team made an offer sheet that Calgary did not match to keep Matthew Tkachuk. So, when that all came about, a trade partner appears. And that trade partner is, again, the Florida Panthers. Now, when you move or are looking at moving a player like Matthew Tkachuk, who's not going to stay with your organization long term, he basically was going to sign just long enough to get on the other side of free agency where he'd be unrestricted. And yeah, Brad Treliving's like, that's not going to happen. So what happens is, if a restricted free agent doesn't sign, he doesn't play. It's that simple. But because of how much Matthew Tkachuk would make, teams have to offer him a certain amount. And then if Calgary doesn't match, they get draft picks as compensation. So Matthew Tkachuk kind of got stuck. Now he just came off of a career year. His momentum is upwards, and if he misses a year, his value goes down. He knows that. So when organizing the trade with the Florida Panthers, one of the first factors that goes into moving a player like Tkachuk is you do not want him to stay in your division, because divisional opponents you will see repeatedly throughout the year. So the fact that the Florida Panthers are out in the Eastern Conference, that already put them at advantage of anybody in the Western Conference who may have wanted to make a trade offer for him. So with only seeing Florida twice a year, Calgary was like, done. Well, we can talk, because knowing the type of player that he is full well, they know what he brings, and they know that you don't want a player like that visiting you more than they have to. So the problem is Florida doesn't meet the compensation requirements to offer sheet Matthew Tkachuk. So I've pulled up what the compensation sheet is. I'm only going to use the two that were relevant for this video. So if Florida was to offer Matthew Tkachuk between $8.4 and $10.5 million, and Calgary did not match it, Florida would have to give up their next 2 first-round picks. They would have to give up their next second-round pick and their next third-round pick. So, that's pretty good compensation. If they had offered him $10.5 million or more, which Tkachuk, I think, in theory, could have leveraged more than that, potentially. I don't think it was incredibly likely, but he could have. At that point, the team has to give up their next 4 first-round picks. I don't think Florida even has any first-round picks currently within the next three drafts, so they don't meet the requirements. So the Florida Panthers had to go and say, hey, if you sign him to an extension for X amount of dollars and then trade him to us, then we can work out a deal. So Calgary and Tkachuk go into talks. They finally agree on an 8-year, $76 million contract on the premise that Tkachuk would be traded to the Florida Panthers. So once that went through, Florida replaced their number 1 left winger from Huberdeau to Matthew Tkachuk, which I think does make Florida better. So I don't really see that as a loss. They also pick up a 4th-round conditional pick, again, dependent on the lottery results at the end of the offseason. They also cleared up about $350,000 in cap space. When you're a team that's in a crunch, you'll take every penny. So that was good news. And in return, Calgary received a new number 1 left winger to replace, which basically would have been Johnny Gaudreau. They also got a top two defensemen in Mackenzie Weegar, a prospect in Cole Schwint. Now, I tried to look up about Cole Schwint because I wasn't familiar with him, and it sounds like he is expected to be an NHL player. He won't move mountains, but he should be an NHL player, so that's not a bad thing to have. And they also receive a new first round pick in 2025, 2026, again, lottery protected. So, what scared Flames fans after that got moved is if if Uyghur and Huberdeau don't sign extensions, then the trade means almost nothing. You basically traded Tkachuk for a draft pick, and that was seen as unacceptable. So rightfully, fans were excited, but they were concerned about the future, and I don't blame them. Now, it didn't take too long. It felt like forever for Flames fans. But Huberdeau did wind up signing an 8-year, $84 million extension, which came out to $10.5 million a year. For a player like Huberdeau, that seemed about on par. That was about what you would expect, given that he just came off of a 115-point season. So Weegar took a lot longer. Weegar and the Calgary Flames did a lot more of a dance, but inevitably he did sign an extension as well for 8 years, $50 million, or it comes out to about $6.25 million a year. So, hey, things are looking good. So you got the trade, you got the extensions, you've still got a draft pick coming your way. So all in all, you're pretty happy that even though you lost Tkachuk, which even when Tkachuk slumps, I can honestly say, having seen him as much as I have, he is entertaining to watch. He is one of those players that if he's on your team, you're going to like him. If he's not on your team, you're not going to like him, and that's by design. So, all is looking good at this point. Now, here's where the really, really good part of the offseason actually comes in. So, you've redone your first line left winger. You've brought in another defenseman. You've got them on pretty reasonable contracts. Not great contracts, but they're reasonable. So we'll take that as a win. So a little bit later into the offseason, all of a sudden, Nazem Kadri signs an extension with the Calgary Flames as an unrestricted free agent. So he signs for 7 years, $7 million a year for a total of $49 million. And then that same day, Calgary trades Sean Monahan and a 2025 first round pick conditional to Montreal for future considerations. So they went, here you go. The reason the draft pick had to go with Monahan was because Calgary kind of had to sell Montreal on taking Monahan. He is a good player, but over the last 2 seasons, he really has not been producing to his contract. Some of it's bad luck, some of it was injury. But at the end of the day, a change of scenery was very much needed. So he goes out. Kadri's now in as your center, as a new center, which the funny thing with Nazem Kadri is back when he was in Toronto and Toronto was initially looking at shopping Nazem Kadri, Calgary was a potential destination for Nazem Kadri. Now, the reason that he didn't come to Calgary was because he said no. Now, immediately a lot of people are like, well, then why did we just pick up a guy who said he didn't want to be here earlier? And the thing with that was it wasn't that Kadri didn't want to play in Calgary, it's that he didn't want to leave Toronto. So I thought that was a little bit interesting that everything came full circle and he winds up on the Calgary roster to begin with. So I mean, all's fair, I guess. And one other movement that kind of got swept under the radar that kind of glues a little bit of this together is that Juuso Välimäki winds up getting waived, I believe, early into the regular season and is claimed by the Arizona Coyotes. Now, Juuso Välimäki was Calgary's 2017 first-round pick, and he was expected to be the new defenseman that was supposed to take over for Giordano. They were going to start building around him, and it just, for whatever reason, didn't pan out. So now you've freed up another spot for for defensemen where Calgary's kind of a little bit over encumbered with them. So I'm going to break down the math on all the movement, and we're just going to kind of get a grand total of what happened here. So you lose your number one and number two left wingers from between Johnny Gaudreau and Matthew Tkachuk. So that knocks out $13.75, almost $14 million just from those two. Then you free up $6.375 million by sending your second or third line center. Usually it was mostly third line in Monahan going to Montreal. You lose your fourth round pick in 2025 in the Florida trade, and your 2025 or 2026 first round pick going with Sean Monahan. Now, here's where you add up what did Calgary bring in. So you brought in Jonathan Huberdeau at $5.9 million this year. You bring in Mackenzie Weegar at $3.25 million this year. You bring in Kadri at $7 million this year. You bring in your prospect, and you bring in your first round draft pick. And that's partially why Calgary was okay sending their first round pick to Montreal with Sean Monahan, because Calgary's betting that they're going to get or that Florida's going to get a better draft position than they are. So they said, take our pick. We've got another one anyway. So pretty smart. We'll see how that pans out. Now, in total, that means that Treliving this year not only freed up $3.75 million in cap space, replaced, arguably upgraded the left wing center, the first line left wing. Wow. Sorry about that stroke. Upgraded your number two center. You lost your number two left winger, but that made room for Dylan Dubé. Dylan Dubé is a pretty prominent left winger. He's not all-star worthy, I don't think, but that he's your second line left wing, you're really not going to argue too much with that. And then added a top two defenseman and filled out what is considered one of the better defensive cores in the NHL right now. And that defensive core looks like Mackenzie Weegar and Chris Tanev, Noah Hanifin, Nikita Zadorov, and Michael Stone on top of Mackenzie Weegar. So, Weegar, Tanev, Hanifin, Zadorov, Michael Stone. Okay. Sorry, I looked at that and then my brain went, I swear I missed somebody. Now, here's the thing. Oliver Shillington, who's a top four defenseman on that core to begin with, is out on LTIR right now. So that means when he comes back, that core is only going to get better, and Stone likely becomes your seventh defenseman. Holy crap, defense is not going to be Calgary's problem this year if they run into issues. So in the 2022 offseason, Brad Treliving basically did an entire rebuild of the Calgary Flames core by losing or moving out three cornerstones of what they were building around, and then found three suitable players to start rebuilding around again, and created a little bit of cap flexibility for himself this year. There's teams that are in 5, 7, 10-year rebuilds that still haven't accomplished that, and he just kind of, give me 2 months and I'll redo it. Okay, fine, cool. Now, the immediate returns on these players is looking really good. It is looking absolutely fantastic right now. And the near future looks good. I think the longer time goes on, it's not going to be as fruitful of a return. But the argument that the three new players' contracts are going to age poorly, yep, probably. I don't think so with Mackenzie Weegar. I think he'll stay around that market value. But yeah, two of the guys likely are going to be overpaid towards the latter years of those contracts. Here's the thing. Brad Treliving isn't looking at 3, 5, 8 years from now. He's looking at this year. Calgary had a really good year last year, and he didn't want to lose that momentum. You want to keep that success going. You want these guys to build on these things. So rather than just letting the guys go and doing a slow rebuild, doing your draft, He basically went, no, I'm fixing it right now. I have the ability to do it. And it's been rewarded so far. So, on the onset of the 2022-2023 season so far, which we're 6 games into at the time I'm doing this, Calgary opened the season 5-1-0, which is a franchise best. So, first and foremost, Calgary has never won their season or opener in the last 10 years or so, at least. Um, and they've never gone 5-1-0 in their first 6. So, immediately, there's an improvement on the normal narrative here. And between the 3 new additions, they have a combined 5 goals, 12 assists, and 17 points in 6 games. What's astounding is that between them, there's Kadri only has 2 penalty minutes so far, which shows that he may be buying into a new system where he's always going to play with that edge, but he's going to be a little bit more mindful of crossing that line. So here's hoping, because the last thing you want is a $7 million player being suspended. That's something he's known for. So some nerd would probably turn around and go, well, what does that look like over an 82 game season? Yeah, I was that nerd. So I did a little bit of projecting based on the current numbers. It's a small sample size and it's likely overly optimistic, but whatever. Let's just, for argument's sake, go through this. So these players combined would project to create 68 goals, 164 assists for 232 points by the end of the season. That actually is a bit optimistic, but when I looked at their career averages in points over 82 games, it's actually not that far out, especially when you consider that all 3 of them came off of very, very good years last year. So, first and foremost, between the 3 players, they total $16.15 million of cap space. Now, when you're projecting at 100 and if you look at their career averages, they'll combine for 54 goals, 119 assists for 173 points. At $16.15 million, that's pretty good production. Now, the important part with this year is all of that's going to change because 2 guys revalue next year by a lot. So, I kind of took their career averages. I looked at their high end this past year, and I kind of went, where's a fair ground to expect? So what I came up with is Kadri coming out of this season at 30 goals, 40 assists for 70 points. At $7 million, you're not going to argue with that kind of production. Could it be lower? Absolutely. Could he surpass that? I doubt it, but we'll see. Huberdeau, I think that 115 points was a career year, and being that he's in a whole new team, I didn't hold weight in him holding that same point production. But what I did think was fair based on his average is if he was to put out 20 goals, 60 assists for 80 points, I think Calgary would be pretty happy with that. I don't think it would be unreasonable to think he would get more than that, but I just wanted to create a baseline for this part of the conversation. And Uyghur was a bit easier. I think if he was to spit out about 5 goals, 25 assists for 30 points, I think that would be absolutely fine based on how much he's making this year. And you basically, on those numbers, you're not likely to really miss a beat. I think Calgary's production last year was a bit of an overachievement, so I expect them to come back down to a little bit more normal. But I think with this kind of production, what you lost and what you're paying for this year to keep your momentum going, those are very realistic numbers. I'd like to know what you guys think, because Kadri and Huberdeau are a little bit older. Again, Mackenzie Uyghur's a defenseman, and they do stay productive later into their career usually. So I'm not really factoring him in too much. But I would think that this you could constitute as a rebuild of your core, and I really hope that other teams take a look at this and don't get so afraid about doing it. There are teams that have held on to a core that was touted to be the core that gets them going, and it just hasn't worked out. And maybe they can see that if they're careful and if they leverage what they have, you can rebuild your core and still be okay. Um, I would think that Pittsburgh would be looking at something to this effect here pretty soon with their core getting older. Um, Vancouver might want to take a look at this and see if they have an option to try and do the same thing. But we'll see how that goes. So I'd like to know what you guys think in the comments section below. Do you think this was the best off season that Treliving's ever had? Do you think it's the worst? Do you think it's going to be good now, bad later, bad now, good later? What do you guys think? I'm genuinely curious on this because again, this was one of those things that it was a perfect storm and a ton of pieces went into this, and it seems like it's working out. My focus on this right now is how is it going to create returns this year? I'm not worrying about the extensions that are kicking in next year because it's not here yet. Let's not borrow trouble. Let's just see if this pans out as planned. So yeah, I'd like to know what you guys think. If you guys did like the video, please drop a like. If you would like to see more, don't forget to subscribe on your way over to the next video that you go watch. And until the next one, please stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe. Thank you, and all the best.